What math do you need to know to take the digital SAT? That's exactly what we're going to talk about in this video. My name's Kristina. I'm the owner and founder of Ivy Lounge Test Prep. And for the last 15 years, I've helped high schoolers around the globe dramatically raise their SAT and ACT test scores and ultimately get into the colleges of their dreams. So let's dig in. So I've noticed something a little bit tricky about the math section of the digital SAT, and that's this. For years, I've noticed students, many of them when they first come to me, they might get straight A's in math, literally every single report card since middle school. And yet, for some reason, their score in the math section of the used to be SAT, now digital SAT, just does not reflect all of these straight A's. Okay. And it's baffling to many of them. But I have come to understand what is going on. And I'm first going to share that with you. Okay. So, probably since sixth grade or so, your math classes, especially if you're in the US, has probably followed a pretty predictable trajectory. Okay. You probably started with some sort of arithmetic pre-algebra class. Then you go to like algebra 1, then usually it's geometry, then algebra 2. And then if you're more advanced, you're going to go on to like pre-calculus and trig. Sometimes it's like the same year, you'll learn both of those. And then ultimately do calculus. Sometimes it's calc AB, and then you move on to BC. Sometimes you just do one of them. But that's usually the order of things, right? So if you're currently a sophomore in high school, depending on like where you are in this trajectory of your math education, maybe you're doing geometry, maybe you're doing algebra 2, or maybe you're doing like some form of pre-calculus. If you're currently a junior in high school, you might actually already be in calculus, though you might only be in algebra 2. Okay. But here's what's really funny. Remember like geometry that you spent a whole year learning? Um, when you then go to take the digital SAT, you're like, wait, where are all the geometry questions? Like, literally, I was spending a whole year studying this. You would expect to see more than just like 3 or 4 questions, right? So there is a discrepancy, is what I'm trying to say, between the order in which you've learned things and how much you have spent learning different topics, and then what proportion of this very stakes test score actually covers those same topics. And then there's another funny thing. When you go to take the digital SAT, maybe you've taken a practice test of it. And all of those like exponential functions or parabolas, quadratic equations, you're like nailing. And then you're getting wrong all of these questions about like ratios and something in scientific notation and like the slope of a line. And you're like, what gives, right? So I noticed this too. And that is a lot of students, when they first come to me, it's actually the easier topics that they are getting wrong on the digital SAT. Why? Because those are things that you learned. Chances are you learned them in middle school, some of them even in, say, sixth grade, like proportions, right? Fractions. Yet now you are being tasked with answering questions on those topics, but like a junior in high school level sophistication of those topics. You've learned them before, but when you learned them, you were probably in middle school. And at that time, you were doing kind of like middle school level sophistication of those same topics. So actually, though you've learned those things before, you've probably never actually practiced questions that really tested you or grilled you on them in such a sophisticated way as now you are being asked. Okay, so that is the first thing I wanted to talk about right off the bat, is why there's such a discrepancy between what and when you are learning this math in school and then your actual math score on the digital SAT. The next thing I quickly want to talk about is the structure of the digital SAT. And then after that, I promise you, we're going to go into all of the different things you need to know. So, the structure of the test. So, on the digital SAT, you get a math section. It is the last half of the test, right? And it is divided into 2 different modules. If you're a regular time test taker, you are going to get 35 minutes to answer the 22 questions in Module 1, right? Obviously, if you're time and a half, you're going to get 1.5 times 35 minutes. Double time, you get 70 minutes, etc. Depending on how you do on that first module, like how many questions you get correct, you're going to either get an easier or a harder second module to the math test, okay? Now the module is the same length. It's still 35 minutes for a regular time test taker, and you've got 22 questions to do in those 35 minutes. So we've got 2 modules. We've got that it's basically computer adaptive. You don't know which second module you're going to get. There's another fun little tweak, right? They're not all multiple choice. So out of these 44 questions that you have between these 2 modules, about 3/4, roughly 33 of them, are going to be multiple choice. But the other approximately 1/4 or 11 questions, and we don't know where these questions are happening, they're interspersed throughout the modules. The other 11 questions are going to be self-produced questions. What that means is you don't have choices to choose from. You instead have to actually solve the problem and then type it in the space provided. You have 4 characters to do this in. Maybe there's a decimal, maybe there's a fraction line, maybe they're all digits. Maybe you only need like 1 character to write down the number 3. It could be a negative number, in which case you get a 5th character to do that negative sign. So that is the basic structure of the digital SAT's math section. And of course, we're gunning for as high of a score as we can, highest score being an 800, lowest score being a 200. And this is based off of how many questions you get correct. And also, well, were you getting these correct and you got the harder module, or were you getting a bunch correct, but it was the easier module? So all of these things factor into your ultimate score of up to 800 points. So hi there, if you're just now tuning in, my name is Kristina of Ivy Lounge Test Prep. And again, I help high schoolers around the globe drastically raise their SAT and ACT test scores and then get into their dream colleges. So right now I have a question for you, and that is, do you find there to be a discrepancy between the things you're spending your time learning in your math class and if you've taken a practice test so far, what it's asking you on the digital SAT's math section? So I want to hear from you. Just let me know in the comments. I'd love to read them. And while you're at it, just go ahead and like this video, just thumbs up it. And then why not just subscribe to my channel? And then that way, whenever there's more updates to the SAT, the ACT, college app essays, and the works, you will be the first to know. So now here's the meat and potatoes of what you came here for, which is exactly what math am I being tested on the digital SAT. The first thing I want to talk about are basic math facts. Now, these might not be like a question all in and of themselves. And you do have a calculator that you get to use called the Desmos calculator that is built into the Blue Book app. And you can bring your own handheld calculator too. But sometimes it saves you a lot of time to just kind of like know how to, navigate numbers, know how to add fractions, things like this. So I'm going to mention a few things here because it will just help your ultimate speed and accuracy so that you can then answer all the questions correctly. Okay, so there's certain things I would just memorize. Like you need to know your addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, times tables, right? I would know your perfect squares up to 25 squared. I would probably know your perfect cubes up to 6 cubed. I would know powers of 2 up to 2 to the 10th. I would probably know my Pythagorean triples, right triangles, like 3, 4, 5, but there's some other ones. And I would probably know some comprehensive like fraction to decimal conversions, right? Just so if they give you something and it's a fraction, you just immediately know, oh, that's like this, and you can plug it into the calculator or whatever. You need to have some versatility to help you work problems quicker. Okay, even though, yes, you do get to use a calculator. So those are some things I would just memorize. I would also know number basics. Okay, so what does that even mean? That means like the number system. So words like rational, integer, whole number. That way, you know what type of number they're looking for in a word problem, right? I would know certain number properties like Okay, I've got odd and evens. Basically, what happens with odds and evens when you add, subtract, multiply, divide them? What about positive and negative numbers? What happens to those when you add, subtract, multiply, divide them, right? Know things about prime numbers. So this will help you immensely when you are, say, solving ratios and proportions or dealing with fractions. You should also know order of operations and the basics of just solving equations, like one-step equation, two-step equation, bigger equations, right? It will help you immensely with everything. So now that you know those basics with how to just literally manipulate numbers, let's talk about problem solving and data analysis, which is the first big topic that the SAT tests you on. So this topic covers 15% of your test questions. That's approximately 7 test questions, right? I get it. I understand that might not seem like a ton of questions, but we're going to do this one first because you need to understand these things in order to really ace all the math skills in the subsequent sections of math topics that we're going to talk about. So let's talk problem solving first. For starters, you need to know how to first translate the English words that are in a word problem into math, into equations. Next, you are going to need to master percent problems, right? That might mean percent increase, percent decrease, percentage of, percent change. They're kind of all different. You need to know exactly what you're doing. After that, you will need to definitely navigate like fractions, ratios, and proportions. And don't forget about all those advanced fraction tricks that will help you easily do that so you don't stumble with your calculator and then get it wrong. Okay, so once you can navigate fractions with ease, then you can handle solving ratio and even compound ratio questions really easily. Finally, you need to know how to correctly calculate multi-step word problems. So that includes like algebra word problems like distance or work or average or rate conversion questions, but that also means certain statistics problems like mean, median, mode, range, standard deviation, and even margin of error. You also need to know all about how to calculate probability, and you might even need to take out those counting principles like, oh, there are 3 appetizers on this menu and 5 entrees and 2 desserts. How many different meals could I get with 1 appetizer, 1 entree, and 1 dessert? Things like that. So those are the problem solving out of the problem solving and data analysis. Now let's go to the data analysis questions. So many SAT questions will require you to interpret charts, graphs, scatter plots, two-way tables, as well as other types of data. You might see a stacked graph. You might see bar graphs. You might see stem leaf plots. You might see histograms, dot plots, even a box whisker plot, okay? So you basically need to understand how to read and interpret all of these because chances are, many times, you will need to locate the correct number in one of those types of charts, graphs that I just mentioned, and then use those to find the probability or find the percent or find the median, etc., right? And then finally, you also need to correctly evaluate what we call statistical claims. So those are the problem solving and data analysis topics that you need to know to get those 7 questions at 15% of the SAT's math section correct. So the next type of math that the digital SAT tests you on is literally called algebra. And honestly, it's such a simple name, but it basically covers over a third of the section. Okay. So algebra, according to the College Board's terminology, includes pre-algebra, arithmetic, right? Those are kind of the same, and Algebra 1 concepts, basically anything having to do with lines and linear equations. So this is a full 35% or 15 questions approximately on the math section. Here's the thing, if you think this is beneath you, remember what I said before. about how a lot of these topics, yeah, you learned it in sixth grade, you learned it in eighth grade, but you learned it at really like easy or medium difficulty levels then. And now they're going to ask you very like sophisticated, I'm a junior or senior in high school levels of these questions. So you need to take these topics, dust them off, and upgrade them. So I'm going to tell you exactly which topics those are. So linear equations, right? So you need to understand what they are, how to recognize them in the real world, how to model them, and like what the x-intercept or what the slope actually means in a given real life scenario. Okay. You'll need to understand all about graphing lines, as well as some topics that we consider coordinate geometry a little bit. So distance formula and the midpoint formula. You also need to master systems of linear equations, i.e., when you've got two linear equations that come together. Like how many solutions, if any, does it have? What is the solution if there is a solution? You also will need to upgrade your knowledge on inequalities, compound inequalities, absolute values, and even how to put absolute values and inequalities together in an equation. So yes, you've heard these topics before. It's probably many years ago, but dust them off and upgrade them now, and you will get a huge chunk of this section correct. The third topic of math on the SAT's math section is called advanced math. Kind of vague, right? And this also covers approximately 35% or like 15 questions of the math section. Okay. And so when I was looking at all the concepts that this includes, I break it down into Algebra 2, and then there's some pre-calc topics. So let me tell you what those are. So in the Algebra 2 category, first, you have exponents, powers, and roots. Then you need to know how to factor quadratic polynomials and then graph the resulting parabolas. Can you find the vertex, the axis of symmetry, the sum of the roots, the product of the roots? You'll need to know how to do all of those things. Next, you'll need to know how to manipulate complex fractions and what we call rational expressions. And finally, you will need to know how to perform certain things like compound interest problems or deal with sequences or solve systems of non-linear equations, i.e. a line with maybe a parabola, and see like how many solutions does that have, if any, and what are they? Now let's go to the things that would be in the pre-calc set of topics that you hopefully have learned. And most of these have to do with functions, okay? So the moment you see f of x, right, f parentheses x, you know you're dealing with a function. And most of the time there's simple equations that, where it's just like y equals f of x. Yes, just the y value is the f of x. So if you have ever worked with functions before, you'll need to understand certain function vocabulary and basics, as well as some coordinate geometry vocabulary, so you can just nab a few extra points. So if you know what they are, and you've worked with functions already, then what you'll need to brush up on are things like finding the domain, finding the range, doing composite functions like f of g of x, stuff like that, or transformation of functions. And then finally, you will need to know how to graph and how to solve exponential functions, which is like 2 to the x as opposed to x squared. So those are all the advanced math topics. Now let's move on to something that I find hilarious, and that is the geometry and trigonometry section of the SAT math. Okay, so what amuses me to no end is that there's certain topics that students will spend an entire year studying, and then like geometry, and then it's like 3 questions on a very high stakes test like the SAT. So that's what we've got going on here with the geometry and the trigonometry portion of the math topics on the digital SAT. It's only 15% of the test questions, so approximately 6 or 7 questions. And they're kind of split up like this. I usually see about 2/3 of those will be various types of geometry, like 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional. So maybe like 4 questions are geometry, maybe 5. And then usually about 2 questions might be trig. So here's what those topics are. So the plane or two-dimensional geometry questions that you might see. So this refers to anything that you can draw on a piece of paper. So like lines, angles, triangles, so like equilateral, isosceles, right triangles, special right triangles. Then you've got polygons, like quadrilaterals. There are many of them. We've got parallelograms, rectangles, squares, rhombuses, and trapezoids. And then there might even be other shapes. And also, don't forget circles, right? So there are many things you might be asked about those. There might be angles, there might be areas, there might be perimeters or circumferences. So expect to be able to find, again, the perimeters, the areas, interior and exterior angles, lengths in similar triangles. That's another biggie. And also be prepared to maybe have to graph a circle on the coordinate plane, or at least interpret an equation and know like what is the radius, what is the center. Now let's go to the solid or three-dimensional geometry topics you might need to know. So the moment you hear volume or surface area, then basically you're talking about 3 dimensions, okay? You're talking about solid geometry. So all solids that the digital SAT could ask you about can basically be broken down into 3 topics: prisms, pyramids, and spheres. Once you know the equations for those, you're golden. Cool. Finally, we have the trigonometry part of geometry and trigonometry. I always kind of giggle when I see like what topics they ask, because I actually liked geometry a lot when I was growing up. And there are so many things the SAT could have asked, and yet they don't care about so many of these concepts. And they literally only have a handful of trig concepts that you need to know. So here's what they are. You need to know SOHCAHTOA. So that means sine, cosine, and tangent ratios and how to calculate them. You need to know what is called the complementary angle relationship. You need to know about radians and converting from degrees to radians and radians to degrees. And then lastly, you need to know the basic trig ratios for some special angles. That's like your 30, your 45, your 60, your 0, your 90-degree angles. So those are all the math topics that you actually need to know. That's crazy, right? Because that probably doesn't really correlate to all the things you spent time studying. But guess what? After years, literally 15 years of teaching students how to ace this test, the old SAT and now the new one, I have all of my knowledge conveniently put into my ultimate digital SAT math guide. So in it, it is a video and ebook course. The ebook that is included is basically the cram plan for the digital SAT's math section. And then I have all sorts of problem solving videos that show you my best math tricks from my competition days, from my math competition days, and ways of moving forward and nabbing a bunch of extra points. So check it out in the link below.